The electoral bond scheme, introduced in 2017 to enhance transparency in political funding, allowed individuals and corporate entities to donate money to political parties anonymously through bonds. However, the Supreme Court of India scrapped the scheme on February 15, citing violations of the rights to information and the potential for quid pro quo arrangements. The scheme had faced criticism for its lack of transparency, anonymity of donors, and concerns about unchecked funding for political parties. The question stands: how far is this aimed at? Hi everybody. The BJP dominated electoral bond contributions, receiving a significant portion of its funding through its mechanism. The case, initiated by the Association for Democratic Reforms, saw opposition from various quarters, including political parties and concerned individuals who raised transparency and corruption concerns. The government argued against disclosing donor information, emphasizing reasonable restrictions on the right to know. The scheme's implementation faced opposition from institutions like the Election Commission and the Reserve Bank of India, further raising transparency and accountability issues. Overall, the electoral bond scheme was intended to bring transparency to political funding but faced significant criticism and ultimately got scrapped by the Supreme Court. One of the comprehensive and insightful questions from the above scenario is: how did the electoral bond scheme impact transparency and accountability in political funding in India, particularly in terms of donor anonymity and disclosure requirements? The electoral bond scheme in India had significant implications for transparency and accountability in political funding. Here's how it impacted these crucial aspects. Number one is donor anonymity. One of the primary features of the electoral bond scheme was donor anonymity. Donors could purchase bonds and donate to political parties without disclosing their identities publicly. This anonymity raised concerns about the lack of transparency regarding the source of political funding. Without knowing the identities of donors, it became challenging to access potential conflicts of interest or undue influence on political decisions. Number two is disclosure requirements. While the scheme mandated that political parties declare the total amount of electoral bonds received, it did not require them to disclose the identities of individual donors. This lack of disclosure undermined efforts to promote transparency in political funding. Citizens and watchdog organizations had limited access to information about the source of funding for political parties, hindering their ability to hold parties accountable for their financial dealings. Number three is impact on accountability. The electoral bond scheme donor anonymity undermined accountability in political funding. Political parties were not obliged to reveal the identities of their donors, which reduced their accountability to the public. Without transparency about the source of funding, there was a risk of potential quid pro quo arrangements or undue influence exerted by donors or political parties and policymakers. This lack of accountability undermined public trust in political process and raised concerns about the integrity of democratic institutions. Number four is challenges to oversight. The lack of transparency and accountability in the electoral bond scheme possessed challenges to regulatory oversight. Government institutions responsible for monitoring political finance, such as the Election Commission and the RBI, faced difficulties in ensuring compliance and preventing potential misuse of funds. The absence of robust disclosure requirements limited the effectiveness of regulatory mechanisms aimed at promoting transparency and accountability in political funding. And number five is unequal influence. The electoral bond scheme raised concerns about unequal influence in political funding. Large corporate entities and wealthy individuals could potentially wield disproportionate influence over political parties through substantial donations via electoral bonds. This inequality's funding sources could skew political priorities and policy making, undermining the democratic principles of liberal representation. Hope you liked the video. Let's unlock together your full potential and achieve remarkable success in the world of business. If you are new to the channel, do like, share and subscribe for more such content related to business and finance. Till then, goodbye everyone.